Hello everyone, it's your host, your friend, your boy, Jet Black, the one and only, here with another exciting video. And in this video, I'm going to react to my friend Jon Mason's video, Heart of the Cards is Real. Let's look at the description for his video, and then let's watch it together and see what our thoughts are on it. So here's Jon Mason's description. How's it going, con people? For once, I can't say it's been a while. This is a short video explaining why randomness does not actually exist, or at least my reasonings to believe it doesn't exist, and why the king of games may not have been cheating with his heart of the cards after all. Kinda. Excuse the noise if you notice it. Lol. And then he has links to his social media and some of the stores that he has. It's always good to promote stuff like that in the description. So without further ado, let's watch Jon Mason's video about why he feels like randomness doesn't exist. I will say, I from the premise disagree, but let's hear his argument. Let's see why he feels like randomness doesn't exist. Blah, blah, blah.
Okay, this is like the ninth time I'm doing this, so I hope I get this right. Anyway, what is randomness? The definition online at least says that randomness is the quality or state of lacking a pattern or principle of organization, that is, unpredictability. Now, when I was a kid, I would play with like dice. So I would roll dice over and over and over and try to predict which numbers they landed on. Yeah, well, I actually got it up to 5 times sometimes, maybe even 6 times. So I would go like, roll, lands on 1. I would tell myself it's gonna land on 5 next, so I rolled it, lands on 5. Roll 3, 2, 4, 6, 1. I would keep rolling on it, I would actually get them, eventually. And as shocking as it was, I realize now that it's because there's no such thing as randomness. It's all a sequence, all a pattern. Now,
Now hold on. To pause it right there, he's like, I get the die roll right, like very often. He's like maybe like up to like 5 times in a row. And he's like, and I've realized the reason why I can predict the die roll so accurately is because there is no such thing as randomness. And it sounds like he's leading into the idea that there is some kind of pattern to like everything. So I'm like, is his argument going to be that randomness doesn't exist because there's some like unified pattern that you can see in everything? And that if you know this pattern, you can predict anything? Because one, that is a very large claim to make in an 8-minute video that we're already 1 minute into. And two, I am very interested in seeing how he then goes to try and support this idea further. Still very skeptical. I have a counter argument already prepared, but I need to hear his premises that lead to this conclusion so that I can then see if his premises are true and if they actually do lead to the conclusion that he has presented.
I love card games. I love games in general, but I love card games. I love strategy games. I play games like Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic the Gathering, Card Fight Vanguard, so on and so forth.
Vanguard and Yu-Gi-Oh are cool.
Anyway, the point is, these card games, generally speaking, have decks of cards with 40 to 60, or in Magic's case, which we will be using for the rest of this example, 60 to about 300 cards. And you
300?
would shuffle these cards as much as you can.
Can you have
in order to
300 cards in a deck in Magic? That sounds crazy.
randomized outcome. Now, of course, in Magic's case, we have to consider that there are up to 4 duplicates of any one card, excluding basic lands, in which case in Magic you can have as many as you please. On average, I run about 18 to 22, but I digress. I'd still come
Wait,
across identical
Magic
cards
doesn't
with
have a
lower
deck cap?
outcomes, even after all of that shuffling and shuffling and shuffling. Why? Because these are smaller sequences. It's not random. You may think it is because we shuffle them so many times, but at the end of the day, it's still a pattern, a sequence that is. Imagine if you shuffled and drew cards, 7 cards, for 10 hours a day. You'd eventually come across a sequence and notice a pattern of patterns, of patterns, of patterns. Those patterns would become so enormous eventually, but they're still patterns. Okay, so add 500 cards. No, add 1,000,000 cards to this experiment. Now draw 7 cards. Let's take it a step further actually. Make sure there are no duplicate cards in the deck. Now, okay, I know that Magic doesn't have 1,000,000 individual cards, but bear with me, okay?
How many cards
You
does
draw
Magic
7
have?
cards from your deck of 1,060 cards, and then you look at your hand, you shuffle it back, and you draw 7 cards. It's hard to imagine that you would get the same exact hand as that first hand of 7 cards within a single lifetime, right? Well, it's still not random. We are just aware of the fact that the sequence takes far too long in our lifetime for us to see it over and over and over again. So, say you were given immortality to live for infinity. You made a, I don't know, you subscribe to me. Actually, this is a good time. If you subscribe to me now, you have a chance to win immortality itself. You will indeed become immortal. You cannot die. Just comment immortality in the comment section below, and you will gain immortality.
Cool, cool. I will indulge. Do, do. Also, to be honest, I kind of like that he does this with his videos, where he'll be like, hey, it's like an obviously fake giveaway. Comment this thing, and you'll not win this like really awesome thing. Because if people indulge you just for the lulz, people still engage directly with your content. I think that's really cool. There's a YouTuber who I saw recently who in a video said, okay, before we start this video up, make sure to smash that like button if you're excited to see more of like what we're doing. And I was like, ooh, I'm not used to people saying smash that like button if you're just hype for the video. But that's cool. Like, I like stuff like this because it gets people to engage, and it's different from what I see a lot of other YouTubers say or do.
I digress. So, say you were given immortality because you subscribed to me down below, typed immortality, and you can live for infinity. That is when you will keep drawing new hands over and over and over from the 1,060 cards, and you will start to notice similarities, you will start to notice patterns. So let's say 100 years to a mortal human being is about a lifespan. They will never be able to see the sequences meet their final loop. But to you, an immortal subscriber, 100 years is
I like that that's what an immortal subscriber
actually,
looks
it's
like.
probably just a day's worth of time. Technically speaking, it's worth no time because time is not a concept to someone that's immortal. So imagine if human beings only lived for 1 year. Imagine that our entire lifespan. Well, okay.
Okay, real quick, because I understand what Jon Mason's trying to say. He's trying to say that, like, if you live for an infinite amount of time, that, like, 100 years your time relative to the amount of time that you're going to live is nothing. And again, that just has to do with, like, relative comparison or whatever. But immortal in what way? Like, are you talking about someone who literally will never die, even like after like the heat death of the universe, or even after like the sun goes out, or even after like, there was like a something that destroyed the planet or whatever? Like, you can survive in space or without like sunlight. Again, that's not really the point. It's just like it's a weird thought experiment. I get it though. Like, I get where I think he's getting at. If I were to make a prediction, now that we're like 5 minutes into the video, I think he's going to say that things seem random to us because we don't have enough time to identify the patterns. But if we lived forever and we kept doing these supposedly like random actions like rolling a die or like shuffling a hand of cards, eventually we'd be able to identify these patterns that require more time to identify than anyone on Earth would actually have time to do. Again, I still have a counter argument, the same counter argument that I've had since the beginning of this video, but I'm going to wait to share it until after I'm done with this video, because I need to hear his premises, determine whether or not his premises are true, and determine whether or not his premises actually lead to his conclusion.
Let me put it this way. Imagine that each month within our year is worth 2 years to us now. So January is 2 years worth to us. February is 2 years worth to us. Our lifespan within a year would be 24 years old, right? That will be our entire lifespan. So, taking that into account, what about things like summer and winter, etc.? We would probably not. Okay, we wouldn't notice them as sequences, but we would probably see them as completely being random. So summer wouldn't be summer, it would just be a weather. Like it would be weather, you know? So now those same humans that only lived for 1 year start to live for our lifetimes. They begin to see the sequences of summer and winter and all this other stuff. They begin to see that it is not random.
Hold on. He threw me with that. So he was like, imagine if humans only live for 1 year, but that within that year, every month is the equivalent of 2 years. And then he was like, so essentially he's saying, imagine if everyone lived for 24 years, but the seasons worked to the... It is a weird thought experiment. I think I get it. Like, I think I get what you said, but now that I'm trying to re-say it's kind of gross. But the seasons occur as they would throughout the individual months, and each of the months last 2 years. So it's more like, what if humans lived for 1 year, but the length of 1 year was actually 24 years, and each month was 2 years long, but retained the weather that it normally would have during like the normal real world calendar, which is that's so much bullshit within like one thought experiment. Anyways, so he's like, winter, like the winter months, you would experience those for like multiple years straight as being like winter. And then he's like, you would experience summer for multiple years straight as just being summer. And he's like, you wouldn't really be able to identify that the seasons happen in a sequence because I guess you die would be the thing. Because if you die at the end of the year, then essentially everyone would... Jon Mason, what are you talking about? So there are like a number of factors that you have to take into account. For one, people would be able to identify the seasons as a sequence. For example, not everybody's born like at the same time. You know, like you have to take into account that some people are going to be born during like January, and some are going to be born during like February, March, April, May, June, etc. And that even though everyone would only live for like a year's worth of time, which is actually like 24 years within the thought experiment, they would still get to live long enough to see like the cycle start again, if that makes sense. Like if you were born on January 1st, you would die like on December 31st or whatever of that like 24 year. But if you were born on like February 1st, you wouldn't die until like that next January or whatever, or something like that. I don't know how the scale slides, to be honest, but you definitely wouldn't die December 31st. You would still have like some change left in your life that the person who was born on January 1st didn't have. I mean, fuck it. You could go even as far as to say, that if you were just born on January 2nd, like I don't even have to jump like a whole month. If you were born on January 2nd, you would die on like January 1st of the next year. And that would give you enough time to see the weather cycle back around to how it was when you were like first born. Like it would then hit that time again, and then be like, oh yeah, this is like when I was born, the first time. It wouldn't hit like the exact day because of the rules that you have set up. You wouldn't be able to live more than 365 of these weird hypothetical days that must actually be a lot longer than normal days. It's really weird setup. They probably would be more like months. Anyways, but yeah, long story short, you would be able to see the weather cycle back around. Like, I don't think that season, like, you wouldn't be able to see the sequence thing makes sense. You would still be able to see the sequence. I just don't think you could ever have a birthday. You could never have a birthday. You would die before your birthday based on how this like lifespan calendar works, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I disagree with the whole concept of you wouldn't be able to see the sequence of the seasons because you would live long enough to see that like within like these few years it was like winter, and now within these few years it's spring, and now for these few years it's summer, and now for these few years it's fall, and now for these few years it's winter again. Like, not only do you get to live through each of the seasons, but you also already get to see it hit winter a second time compared to like when you were alive the first time. Also, record keeping is like a thing. So you would be able to like look at like the records of like past people who died and be able to go, oh yeah, like I noticed that in this documentation, like these written records or even in these videos or whatever, that during like this time on the calendar, it was like winter weather. And that and all the documents that I see that come from similar times of the year from many past years, it's always been winter, and you'd be able to recognize the pattern. I just feel like the thought experiment doesn't really set it up to where no one would be able to tell what the pattern was. But my counter argument will like help. I think I have a good thought experiment as a part of my counter argument that may help you understand why I feel like randomness is definitely a thing. Because I have, like, I'm essentially going to argue like the complete opposite of what you're arguing. But let's continue real quick.
Random, but happens within loops that were far too great for them to notice before, but now they can. So take us, for example. We're so small in terms of our lifespans that we believe in the illusion of randomness, when really and truly it doesn't, or rather cannot exist if there is infinity. If there was an end to infinity, maybe there would be an end to the sequence. And if the sequence ends, then it was overall a random event. But there would be no, well, because there would be no events to build on that sequence because infinity didn't exist to compensate for additional sequences. What is the definition of infinity then? Limitless or endless in space, extent, or size. Impossible to measure or calculate, at least right now. Anything within infinity is not random, but may be taken also by beings with a lifespan within infinity. My statement is if infinity exists, randomness does not exist. So, at the end of the day, Yugi, Heart of the Cards might actually be a real thing. It might just be that he knows how to predict randomness on a scale of imagine that randomness actually exists, but it doesn't. It's just patterns. He sees the patterns, oddly enough, and that's.
I don't see how those two things connect. So he's like, if infinity exists, then randomness cannot exist. What about what about a lack of infinite time makes something not random? hold on. I'm trying to like phrase what I'm trying to say because there's a lot that's been presented in this video, and we're still not even done with the video yet. But it seems like he's laid out his premises, I guess. It sounds like he's saying you can identify patterns if you have infinite time to do so. And the only reason why we can't identify patterns is because we just don't have enough time. But what evidence do you have that supports that if you did have enough time that you'd be able to identify the patterns? I think is like a good question. But also, why is it that infinite time is required in order to identify the patterns? Like, even if it was true that the issue is that we just haven't spent enough time in order to identify the patterns, why do you need infinite time to do so? Wouldn't that be relative to the pattern? If that was a thing? Again, I think randomness is a thing, and I don't think it has anything to do with like the amount of time that you have to find patterns. But let's finish the video real quick, and then I'll explain my thoughts.
How it works. So if infinity exists, randomness is nothing more than a concept. Where does that bring us? I would probably say that this is a step towards proving there is indeed a creator. Because if everything is intentional, a pattern, if everything is a pattern, then there must be something. Yeah, that's pretty much the end of the video.
It became like a teleological argument for the existence of God. That's not where I thought that was going to go at all. So hold on. So he's saying if we have infinite time that we can identify any pattern, which means that randomness doesn't exist. And he's saying that if everything is a pattern, then that proves that the universe was created by a God because God would have set into place all those patterns. Essentially saying like those patterns couldn't naturally exist. They must have been like put there by someone. That argument is very similar to the like clockmaker argument. The idea that if you saw a clock sitting in a forest, you wouldn't assume that the clock was naturally there. You would assume that someone created the clock. And in the same way that you would assume that someone created the clock based on like its form, function, and purpose, that you should too assume that like the world was created for a purpose by a creator. Now, the argument against like the clockmaker argument is that we are the ones who are determining what purpose is. So in the same way that you're like, if we can determine that everything is a pattern, then that must show that like the pattern was deliberately created. We are the ones who are identifying said pattern, and the pattern is just more of like a concept thing that is within our own minds. It doesn't mean that there's some greater force that made a pattern exist. It's like we are the ones who are making things into patterns by like conceptualizing sequences. Like it doesn't mean that essentially we attribute purpose to things. You know, like when you look at a clock, right? You go, this clock was designed to like tell time. That's the purpose of this clock. That's why it was made. But like if a Neanderthal saw a clock, they might be like, this is like easy to hold in my hand, and I could probably throw it pretty far. This is probably like a hunting weapon made to like kill like animals or whatever. Like purpose is just a bullshit thing that we can apply to anything and just say, this must be the purpose of the thing because it fits parameters that'd be useful for a thing. That's just something that we do through like analysis. And I feel like that's like the big counter argument to most theological arguments, is to say that like you can't just say that because you think something has a specific purpose that means it must have been created by someone to have that purpose. So if purpose is kind of like a meaningless subjective thing that we put on the world around us, then you can't say that the existence of purpose means that there's some existence of some greater creator. That's not necessarily to argue whether or not like God exists, but that's like the major argument against like theological arguments like that. Now about your main argument about like randomness not existing, I am in the camp that randomness definitely exists and that the opposite is true, that like certainty doesn't exist. So, David Hume is a philosopher, and David Hume is famous for many different philosophical arguments, but the one that I know him for personally is the problem of induction. So, the problem of induction says that you cannot predict the future based on the past. Which I feel like Jon Mason would feel very heavily against the problem of induction. He'd be like, that's kind of my whole argument, is that you can predict the future based on the past. Well, it comes down to like an argument about like causality and how like causality works and whether or not causality is actually a thing or not. David Hume would say that you can't prove that causality exists. So a lot of the way that we like study the world is by observation. We see that when one thing happens, that another thing happens, and we kind of ingrain that into our mind, and we use that in order to make predictions about the world in order to live through our everyday lives. So you could argue that a lot of our life is based on trying to find these patterns of cause and effect. But here's a thought experiment that talks about the problem of induction and why you can't really rely on that. Let's say that there's a color. We're going to call the color grue. The color grue is different from all other colors that we know of because the color grue looks green for a certain amount of time. But after that amount of time is passed, it turns blue, and then it looks blue from then on out. Now, it's common knowledge that all emeralds are green, but what if all emeralds were grue? You could say that every time anyone has ever looked at an emerald, they have identified it as green. So we should identify all emeralds as green. And people would be able to like reliably depend on that until suddenly that time's hit where grue turns from green to blue. And then from that point on, everybody would be like, well, every time everyone's ever looked at one of these emeralds, they're blue. So clearly all emeralds are blue. And you'd be able to check like as many times as you wanted. And every time you checked, it would be blue. And you'd be like, aha. So the future resembles all the past observations. But that wouldn't be true because of the fact that the rules that we thought like made sense were not like set in stone rules that are always true. And this thought experiment is in response to like the thought experiment that you had with the calendars and everything. I didn't come up with the grue thought experiment. That's just a famous thought experiment that talks about the problem of induction. But here's a like challenge, I guess, for anyone who disagrees with the problem of induction about how you can't predict the future based on the past. Or more, it's weird to say you can't predict it. It's more that you can't be certain of the future based on the past. The argument is that you can't prove certainty without using circular reasoning. Because essentially, people will argue that like the sun comes up every day, and every day I go outside and the sun comes up, so the sun must come up every day. And there are like more complex rules to like why the sun comes up. There's a lot of like science and stuff behind it. But all of those rules are again based off of like cause and effect and logic that says if this happens, then this other thing happens. But there really isn't any way to prove that when like X happens, Y happens, no matter how many times you see it, because similar to the grue thought experiment, you know, things could just suddenly change and there'd just be no way of knowing ahead of time. Like the rules to the world seem very straightforward to us, but we really don't know enough to say anything with certainty. And if you can't prove that cause and effect are a thing, then really any random event could happen at any time. Like there's no way to be certain that something is going to happen just because you do something that has led to that consequence many times before. I feel like I may not be doing the problem of induction justice, but that's probably because it's like 1:39 a.m. and also because this video that I just watched was kind of a roller coaster. But if this was confusing, then I would highly recommend looking up David Hume's problem of induction. There are many fine people who have done a much better job of explaining this concept than I'm trying to do right now. But I hope this makes sense. Like, how would you prove that cause and effect exist without just using cause and effect to prove that it exists? Like, if you say every time I squeeze this ball, it makes like a specific sound, and I've squeezed this ball like 1,000 times and it always makes the same sound. It's like you're using the premise that the future will resemble the past to prove the conclusion that the future resembles the past. And your premise and your conclusion can't be the same without creating a circular reasoning fallacy, which essentially makes your argument invalid. So if you say that your premise and conclusion are the same thing, then you have like incorrect argument. Like someone can just say, well, that's not like proper reasoning. But there's no other way to really prove that the future resembles the past without using circular reasoning, which means that you can't prove that the future will resemble the past, which means the future can literally be anything, and there's no way to know for certain what the future will be. So yeah, that's my argument. Really, it's David Hume's argument. But while you're arguing that randomness doesn't exist and that everything is a pattern, I'm siding with David Hume in saying that there actually like is no pattern that we can prove, and that we can't be certain of anything in regards to our future. Somehow I feel like within like the last couple minutes I became more coherent. But anyways, thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of Jon Mason's original video? I'm going to have a link to his channel and to this video in the description box below. Definitely make sure to head over to his channel and subscribe and smash that like button. Also, don't forget to comment in his comment section, immortality, if you want to get his fake guaranteed immortality. But anyways, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. If you guys like this video, make sure to smash that like button, favorite, comment, subscribe, and ding, 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 ring the notification bell to be notified whenever we do these videos. This is your host, your friend, your boy, Jet Black, the one and only, logging out. Peace. Chicka-da-ga.